Struggling single dad takes in too fat bride dumped at altar. She became the mom his son never had. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The bridal shop sat quiet under the soft amber glow of the setting sun, its curtains drawn but not closed, like a heart still hoping even when it should know better. Inside, Clara Mayfield stood alone in front of a mirror that had seen countless brides, laughing, crying, doubting, beaming, but never one like her. Not tonight. She adjusted the hem of the dress with fingers that trembled, not from excitement, but from something colder, older, a sadness stitched into the seams of her life. The dress was ivory, hand-sewn, with lace sleeves that reached just past her elbows, modest in design, but crafted with care. It was the kind of gown made not to impress, but to hold, to cradle the hopes of a woman who had spent most of her life stitching dreams for others while hers quietly unraveled. Clara had sewn wedding gowns for nearly 15 years in Pine Hollow, a sleepy town tucked between the hills and the hush of forgotten promises. Her hands, calloused yet gentle, had created silk fantasies for women who whispered their insecurities in the fitting room, hoping a dress might silence the voices in their heads. She never judged, she understood. She, too, had spent her youth wishing to be less wide, less quiet, less invisible. So when Mark Bennett had knelt beneath the old oak tree behind her shop last spring, ring in hand and uncertainty in his eyes, Clara had said yes. Not because she believed in fairy tales, not even because she was in love in the kind of way songs were written about, but because he was kind and safe and didn't flinch when her laugh came too loud or her body took up space. He told her once, "Simple is beautiful." So Clara had designed a dress that was simple. Soft lines, no fuss, a silhouette that nodded instead of announced. She had sewn it in the early mornings and late nights, often alone, whispering to the fabric like a prayer. Not for grandeur, just for enough. The wedding was set for tomorrow. The cake was paid for. The chairs arranged. Her best friend Sadie had even pressed wildflowers between hymn books for the centerpieces. But now, as she stood in the glow of the quiet shop, Clara felt like an actor in a play whose audience had long since left. Her phone buzzed on the counter. She hesitated, then reached for it with slow, uncertain fingers. "Mark, I'm sorry. I can't do this. Please don't call." That was it. No explanation. No volvié. Just a full stop at the end of a sentence she hadn't finished writing. Clara didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply sat, carefully, on the edge of the velvet chair in the corner, the one where so many brides had once giggled or gasped at their reflections, and stared at herself in the mirror. The woman staring back was not surprised. That was the worst part. Somewhere deep down, a voice she had buried long ago whispered, "Of course he left. Why would anyone stay?" She stayed there until the sky outside turned the color of bruised lavender. The light shifted. The world moved on. Eventually, she stood. She changed out of the dress, folded it gently, like it still mattered, and placed it in the ivory box she had set aside for her future. The words on the lid shimmered in gold, "For the day you'll never forget." She almost laughed. Instead of going home, to the tiny apartment above her shop with its lonely refrigerator and stack of untouched bridal magazines, Clara walked. The church was only 2 blocks away. Her feet knew the path, even if her heart did not. By the time she reached the steps of Pine Hollow First Church, the sun had dipped low, casting shadows over the worn stone steps. She sat there, the dress box beside her, hands folded in her lap. No bal, no bouquet, just silence and the sound of her own breathing. That's where Jonas Whitaker found her. He wasn't looking for anyone, just walking his 8-year-old daughter, June, home from the library. Their Friday night ritual. June loved picture books about dogs and the moon. Jonas loved the quiet. He noticed Clara because June stopped mid-step and tugged on his sleeve. "Daddy," she whispered, "why is that lady sitting all alone in a wedding dress box?" Jonas turned. He saw her. Not just the woman in a navy coat with wild curls tucked behind her ears, but the grief around her like a halo. The way she held that box, like it was both anchor and ghost. He hesitated. Normally, he would have kept walking. Grief wasn't a stranger to him, but he'd long since stopped trying to fix what he didn't understand. Still, something about the way Clara's shoulders curled inward, like she was holding herself together out of sheer habit, made him pause. "You okay, ma'am?" he asked, voice gentle, as if anything louder might break her. Clara looked up, startled. She tried to smile, but it faltered halfway. "I'm fine," she said too quickly. "Just waiting." Jonas nodded, not pushing. June had already wandered closer, eyes wide. "Is that your wedding dress?" Clara blinked. "Yes." "You look sad," June said simply. Clara looked down. "I guess I am." A silence stretched between them. Not awkward, not empty, just true. Jonas cleared his throat. "We live just a few blocks down. If you'd like a warm place to sit for a bit, well, we've got leftover stew and a fireplace that works when it wants to." Clara hesitated. "I promise I'm not crazy," Jonas added. "Just human." She glanced at June, at the kind face of a man with sawdust on his boots and tenderness in his tone. Then she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "Thank you." He picked up the box. It was lighter than he expected. They walked in silence, the three of them, past the library, past the bakery with its lights off, past the lives moving forward. And somewhere between the chapel steps and the little white house with peeling paint and a crooked porch swing, Clara Mayfield let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, kindness wasn't dead. And neither was she. The quiet welcome. The porch light flickered once, then steadied, casting a soft, golden hue across the weathered boards of the Carter house. Clara stood just outside the doorway, the hem of her coat brushing her knees, her hands still wrapped tightly around the ivory box. She didn't move until Jonas gently nudged the door open wider. "It sticks sometimes," he said with a quiet smile. "House is old, got more charm than sense." She offered a small nod, stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon and old books, the kind of scent that lingered in corners and stayed with you long after you left. A quilt lay draped over the back of a faded couch. A stack of puzzles leaned against the wall. There was a lived-in softness to it all, like the house had grown tired with time, but never bitter. "Make yourself comfortable," Jonas said, setting the box down gently near the coat rack. "It's not fancy, but it's warm." Clara hovered by the entryway, unsure whether to sit or stand, to stay or run. Her body moved slower than her mind, like it hadn't caught up to the sudden shift in her story. In the quiet, she heard the soft padding of small feet. Eli peeked around the corner, a worn book clutched to his chest. "Hi," he said shyly, pushing his glasses up with one finger. Clara offered him a gentle smile. "Hi there." Jonas ruffled Eli's hair. "Why don't you go pick out a story for bedtime? Something short. It's late." Eli nodded and padded off down the hallway. Jonas turned to Clara. "Can I fix you a plate? We got leftover stew. And cornbread. The real kind, not that sweet stuff." She hesitated, then nodded. "That would be nice. Thank you." He moved into the kitchen with quiet efficiency, the sounds of clinking dishes and the microwave humming filling the air. Clara sank slowly onto the edge of the couch, her fingers brushing the soft texture of the quilt. It reminded her of something from childhood, a grandmother long past, who used to hum hymns as she sewed. A few minutes later, Jonas returned with a steaming bowl and a chipped mug of tea. "Mint," he said, setting it down. "Best I could do." She reached for the mug. Their fingers brushed briefly. "It's perfect." They ate in near silence, the kind that didn't feel heavy or awkward, just real. Clara took small bites, unsure if she was truly hungry or just being polite. The stew was hearty, the kind that settled in your chest and stayed a while. From down the hall, Eli's voice floated back. "Daddy, you forgot the monster light." Jonas stood with a soft chuckle. "Be right back." Clara listened to his footsteps fade, then return. When he sat down again, he didn't ask questions. He didn't press. He just sipped his tea and watched the fire flicker in the old wood stove. "You don't have to talk about it," he said after a while. "But if you want to, I'm a good listener." Clara looked into her tea. The steam curled gently into the space between them. "He left," she said softly. "A text message. Day before the wedding." Jonas nodded once. "I'm sorry. That's cruel." She swallowed. I thought I saw it coming. But still, part of me hoped I was wrong. Hope's stubborn that way. She looked up at him, then really looked. His face was tired but kind. The kind of tired that came from love that had been tested, not just time. Your wife. He nodded. Cancer. 3 years ago. Eli was 5. I'm sorry. So was I. The silence stretched again, but this time it held something different. Shared understanding. Mutual ache. Clara set her bowl down, her appetite replaced by something else. I don't know why I came with you. I don't usually. Me neither, Jonas said. But sometimes, people just need a place to land. A pause. Then, you can stay the night. Couch pulls out. Sheets are clean. She didn't answer right away. But, eventually, she nodded. Jonas stood, handed her a folded blanket. You're safe here. No one expects anything from you tonight. Just rest. Clara unfolded the blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders. For the first time in days, maybe weeks, her body began to unclench. Not all the way, but enough. Jonas turned down the hallway. Before he disappeared, he said over his shoulder, We're up early around here. Pancakes if Eli gets his way. Clara smiled faintly. I like pancakes. She stayed up for a while, watching the fire die down. The box sat beside the coat rack, silent and white. A chapter unopened. A promise unfulfilled. But maybe not forever. As the flames gave way to embers, Clara closed her eyes and leaned back. The blanket smelled like cedar and old stories. The house creaked like it was breathing beside her. And in that quiet, sacred stillness, something inside her finally exhaled. Where the light lands. The mornings came soft in the Carter house. Not with alarms or schedules, but with the smell of toast, the creak of the old wood floorboards, and the quiet hum of a house learning how to hold new rhythms. Clara Mayfield had been there 5 days. She hadn't meant to stay. The overnight bag she carried the night she arrived remained unpacked at the foot of the guest bed. And yet, every morning, she found herself standing in the kitchen beside Jonas, coffee in hand, watching Eli smear jelly across toast like it was a masterpiece in progress. Jonas didn't ask questions. Not once had he asked what had happened before the church steps. He didn't pry. He didn't offer solutions. He simply passed the butter, cleared a chair for her at the table, and treated her presence like it was the most natural thing in the world. Clara had lived most of her life being overlooked or examined. This quiet acceptance was foreign and tender. It was Eli who first asked, with the guileless curiosity of a child. Are you going to stay here forever? He said between bites of scrambled eggs. Clara blinked. She looked up at Jonas, who paused mid-sip of his coffee, but didn't interrupt. Not forever, Clara said softly. Just a little while. Eli shrugged, as if that answer was more than good enough. Okay, but if you leave, can you leave your cookies recipe? She laughed then, a real one. Not the brittle kind she'd been offering out of politeness, but a laugh that came from her belly, unplanned and clean. Jonas smiled into his mug. That morning, after Jonas had gone to work at the hardware store, Clara wandered into the backyard. The garden, like the house, was a little wild, a little tired, but honest. Weeds grew stubborn in the corners. Tomato vines tangled along the fence. A single marigold, small and sunbright, peeked through a crack in the soil. She found a pair of gloves in the shed and began to clear the patch by the porch. It wasn't that she had a green thumb, but her hands, long used to delicate stitching and fabric, needed something real to touch. The soil clung to her fingers like memory. She didn't know what she was planting, maybe nothing. But the act itself felt like prayer. Eli joined her an hour later, dragging a little plastic watering can. Can I help? You could be in charge of watering, Clara said, scooting over to make space. But only if you promise not to drown them. I promise, he said solemnly, then immediately overwatered the marigold. Clara didn't scold. She just smiled and handed him a towel. That night, over a dinner of roasted chicken and green beans, Clara asked Jonas if she could repaint the kitchen cabinets. They're fine, he said, looking around. They're beige. He tilted his head, considering. Beige isn't a feeling, Jonas. He laughed. All right, paint away. The next day, she went into town. Pine Hollow wasn't big, but it had a charm built on repetition. The same faces, the same streets, the same rhythm. Clara had avoided it since the incident. But now, she walked into the hardware store and picked out a soft blue-gray paint with a name like Cloud Dusk or Storm Lullaby. She didn't linger. She nodded politely to those who looked her way and made her way back before lunch. She painted with the windows open, old records playing in the background. Eli sang along, mostly off-key. Jonas came home to the scent of fresh paint and cinnamon. Clara had baked again. "You planning to renovate the whole house?" he asked, stepping into the kitchen. "Maybe just the parts that need to remember they can be more than functional," she replied. Jonas looked at her a long moment, then said, "You too, huh?" She held his gaze. Her eyes were tired, but steadier now. "Yeah, me too." Some evenings, after Eli had gone to bed, they sat on the front porch in silence. Not the kind that begged to be filled, but the kind that let you breathe deeper. Clara found herself watching the way Jonas rested his hands in his lap. Rough from work, strong, but unhurried. She watched the way he looked at the stars, as if they still had something to say. She hadn't trusted quiet for a long time. Silence had always been the space where her doubts echoed. But here, with the crickets chirping and the porch swing creaking beneath them, quiet felt like kindness. She began sewing again, not dresses, not yet, but mending. Ilias Doran sleeve, a fraying cushion cover, a small rip in Jonas's flannel. The small acts of repair felt like purpose without pressure. Each stitch was a way of saying, "I see the brokenness, and I choose to tend to it anyway." One evening, Eli padded into the kitchen holding a drawing. "I made us," he said, beaming. Clara unfolded the paper. There were 3 stick figures holding hands. One tall with a beard, one small with a red shirt, and one with a triangle dress and curly hair. "That's you," he said, pointing to the one in the dress. Clara's throat tightened. "You drew me?" "Yeah," Eli said. "Because you're here now." She nodded slowly, tracing the lines of the drawing. It was messy, uneven, imperfect, and it was one of the most beautiful things she'd ever been given. That night, she tucked the drawing into her overnight bag, still unpacked, and for the first time, she thought maybe she wouldn't be leaving so soon. Maybe, just maybe, she could stay until the cabinets dried, until the tomatoes grew, until she could laugh without surprise, until she remembered how it felt to belong. And outside, beneath the moonlight, the marigold beside the porch stood taller than the day before. Some things, Clara realized, didn't need to be rushed. They just needed time and light to grow. The scissors trembled slightly in Clara's hand as she held them above the ivory fabric. It was still early, the light barely stretching across the small kitchen floor, and outside the frost clung to the windows like breath. The house was silent except for the soft hum of the heater and the occasional creak from old floorboards that had long learned to live with silence. The dress lay across the kitchen table, carefully unfolded. It was beautiful. Delicate lace sleeves, a bodice structured to hide rather than highlight, a skirt that flowed more like apology than celebration. She had sewn every inch of it with care, with longing. But now, as it rested under her gaze, it felt like something made for someone else. Someone smaller, someone quieter, someone who didn't exist anymore. She took a deep breath and lowered the scissors. The first cut was the hardest, not because it hurt, but because it freed her. She trimmed the sleeves first, removing the cap that had once felt like armor. Then she unstitched the tightly cinched waist, letting it breathe. The neckline softened. The bodice reshaped. The dress began to transform not into something new, but into something true. And as she worked, her shoulders relaxed. By the time Eli padded into the kitchen, hair tousled and dragging his blanket behind him like a favorite story, Clara was sitting cross-legged on the floor, measuring lengths of lace with quiet reverence. "You're making a new dress?" he asked, rubbing his eyes. Clara looked up and smiled. "Sort of. I'm giving this one a second chance." Eli sat beside her, his small hands tracing the edge of the fabric. "Is it for you?" She paused. "Yes, this time it is." He nodded like this made perfect sense, then leaned his head against her shoulder. For a few moments, they sat in silence, 2 hearts stitched together by circumstance and something deeper. Later that morning, Jonas returned from the hardware store with a bag of nails and a newspaper folded under his arm. Clara was at the sewing machine by then, the new bodice slowly taking shape. He paused in the doorway, watching her for a moment longer than he intended. "Didn't mean to interrupt," he said softly. "You're not," Clara replied without turning. "Just finding my way back." Jonas nodded. He understood that. He'd done it 2 years ago, one piece of furniture at a time. The day passed gently. Clara worked on the dress in stretches, taking breaks to help Eli with a jigsaw puzzle or warm up soup for lunch. Each stitch she sewed was less about fabric and more about restoration. Not of the dress, of herself. That evening, after dinner, she laid the altered dress across the bed and stood in front of the mirror. For a moment, she hesitated. Then, with careful hands, she stepped into it. It fit differently now. Not tighter or looser, but truer. The neckline no longer choked. The waist no longer restrained. The sleeves grazed her arms like grace, not guilt. Clara stared at her reflection and saw, for the first time in a long time, a woman she wanted to be. Not a bride, not a symbol, just herself. She wore the dress out to the backyard, where the evening had begun to settle like a warm hush over the town. The garden was still asleep for the season, but the air smelled faintly of rosemary and damp earth. Jonas was on the porch, sanding a piece of old cedar. He looked up when he saw her. Clara stood in the doorway, barefoot, the fabric moving around her like breath. "It's the same dress," she said before he could speak. Jonas set his tools down slowly. "Looks different." "It is," she replied. "Because I am." They didn't say much more. They didn't need to. Jonas nodded, and Clara sat beside him on the porch swing that creaked like it remembered laughter. They watched the stars come out together. And for the first time, Clara didn't feel like a guest in someone else's life. She fell home. In the days that followed, she folded the original lace scraps into a small box and tucked it onto a shelf above her sewing desk. Not to forget them, but to honor them. They were a part of the journey, even if they no longer served the destination. She began sketching again. Not gowns for thin silhouettes or perfect poses, but dresses for real women, for shoulders softened by time, for bellies that had carried children, for arms strong from work, for hearts brave enough to begin again. And in the margins of her notebook, she wrote one word over and over. Reclamation. Because that was what this was. Not comeback, not revenge, but a quiet, deliberate reclaiming of self, of joy, of worth, of womanhood not defined by someone else's gaze, but by her own becoming. And so, the woman in the dress that was never worn became the woman who wore truth, one thread at a time. When the past knocks, it was a quiet Tuesday, the kind that smelled faintly of coffee grounds and warm laundry. Clara stood by the kitchen window, hands wet with soap, watching Eli chase butterflies through the backyard. His laughter spilled like sunlight through the glass, and she smiled without thinking. These moments had become the thread of her days, simple, unstaged, and full of grace. Jonas was in the garage, working on an old chair for a neighbor. She could hear the rhythm of his sanding, steady and grounding, like a heartbeat for the house. In just a few weeks, this place had become a kind of sanctuary. Not a fairy tale, not perfect, but a place where she had begun to feel real again. That was when a knock came. It wasn't the gentle knock of a neighbor borrowing sugar or Eli's enthusiastic tap after collecting another pine cone. It was sharp, certain, the kind of knock that belonged to someone who assumed they still had the right. Clara dried her hands slowly. Her heart didn't race. Instead, a calm spread over her, quiet but unwavering. She opened the door. Graham Ellis stood on the porch, hair combed too neatly, blazer too stiff for a town like Pine Hollow. In his hand was a bouquet of peonies, her favorite. Or at least they had been once. "Clara," he said. His voice was just as she remembered, polished, practiced. "I wasn't sure you were still here." She didn't answer right away. Just stepped out onto the porch, letting the door close gently behind her. The distance between them felt longer than the 3 wooden steps. "I heard what happened," he continued. I heard what I did. And I know it's too late, but I wanted to say I'm sorry." She looked at him for a long moment. His face hadn't changed, but something in her had. Deeply, I believe you, she said softly. But I don't need your apology anymore. He blinked. Clara, I panicked. The wedding, it was all moving so fast, and I didn't know how to say it, so I didn't. I just left. And that was wrong. But I've thought about you every day. Her eyes stayed steady. She didn't flinch. Do you know what it's like, she said, to sit in a dress you made yourself outside a church and realize that all the little voices that ever told you you weren't enough were right? Graham looked down. I never meant to make you feel that way. But you did, she replied gently. And not just by leaving. You did it every time you looked through me. Every time you complimented my silence instead of my presence. Every time you loved the idea of me, not the reality. He stepped forward, bouquet trembling slightly. But I'm here now. I came back. Doesn't that mean something? Clara took a deep breath, the kind that felt like it came from years beneath her skin. It means you realized what you lost. Not who I am. Silence stretched. From inside, the sound of Eli's laughter rang again, clearer this time, like a bell. Graham followed the sound with his eyes. You have a child? Clara shook her head. He's not mine by blood, but he calls me Clara. Sometimes Miss Clara. And sometimes, when he forgets, he calls me Mom. Graham took another step. And the man who lives here? She didn't answer. Not with words. Just turned slightly toward the house. The garden bed she had helped plant, the swing they had fixed together, the windows she had washed not for show, but so the light could fall better in the mornings. He sees me, she said at last. Not the version of me I try to shrink into, but all of me, even the broken parts. Graham swallowed, his composure cracking just slightly. I thought maybe we could try again. Maybe. There's still something left. Clara stepped down to the bottom step, now only a breath away from him. Her voice was soft, not unkind. Graham, I'm not angry. Truly, I'm not. I think you did the best you could with what you knew then. But I've grown. I'm not the woman you left. I'm stronger now. Softer, too. And I don't need to be chosen to know my worth. He looked like he wanted to argue, to plead. But all he said was, you really mean that? She nodded. He offered her the bouquet. She hesitated, then took one stem from the bunch, a single peony, and held it gently. Thank you, she said, for coming, for letting me say this. He stood there for another moment, then turned and walked down the path. Not out of anger, not even heartbreak, just understanding. Clara watched until he disappeared down the street. Then she walked back inside. Jonas looked up from the garage doorway, saw her empty hands, her calm face. Everything all right? She nodded. Better than all right. He didn't ask more, just stepped aside as she passed, their shoulders brushing. Later, she placed the single peony in a mason jar by the window, not as a memory of Graham, but as a marker of who she had become. Someone who didn't need to fit into someone else's mold. Someone who had found her own home and her own heartbeat. And for the first time in a long time, she was not waiting for the next chapter. She was already living it, stitching her way home. The studio above Maggie's bakery wasn't much, just a square room with slanted ceilings, a cracked window that stuck in the winter, and a floor that creaked like it had memories of its own. But for Clara Mayfield, it was a beginning. She moved in with little ceremony. A second-hand sewing machine, a stack of muslin, a chipped teacup that had survived more kitchens than she cared to count. Maggie, wide-hipped and always smelling faintly of cinnamon and salt, helped her carry the last box up the stairs and set it down gently by the window. You sure you want to do this here? Maggie asked, wiping her brow. Clara looked around at the dust dancing in the sunlight. It feels like the right place to start. Maggie gave a single nod, the kind that said, then it's already done. That afternoon, Clara unpacked her scissors like relics, laid out bolts of soft cotton and linen dyed in colors that looked like they'd been stolen from the sky just before dusk. She didn't sketch wedding gowns anymore. Not the kind draped in fantasy and cinched in tight expectation. Now she sketched dresses meant to move, meant to breathe. The first one she made was for Linda Keene, a retired elementary school teacher who'd never married but had raised 3 nieces like they were her own. Linda asked for something loose and lavender, with deep pockets for tissues and peppermint. And please, she'd said shyly, make it so I don't feel like I'm pretending to be someone else. Clara nodded. That's all I make now. dresses that feel like home. Word spread quietly like good bread. A mother of 5 came in, holding her youngest on her hip, and asking if Clara could make her something she could wear to church and still feel like herself. A woman in her 70s brought a dress from her youth, worn thin but filled with stories, and asked if Clara could turn it into something her granddaughter might wear on her wedding day. Clara didn't promise magic. She promised honesty. Thread by thread, she sewed dignity back into fabric. She learned to see not just body shapes, but the burdens each woman carried, and made room for them. Her studio became more than a workspace. It became a haven. Maggie would bring up leftover scones, still warm. Eli would sit on the floor with crayons, drawing dresses with superhero capes. And sometimes Jonas would come by after dinner, leaning on the doorway with his arms crossed, just watching her work without saying much at all. He never commented on how she glowed more now, how her shoulders had relaxed, how laughter came easier. But his eyes saw her, fully. One evening, after hemming a gown for a widow named Ruth who was getting remarried at 68, Clara sat on the studio floor, surrounded by scraps. Her hands were tired, her heart full. Maggie came up, 2 mugs of tea in hand. She handed one to Clara and sat beside her with a heavy sigh. "You know," Maggie said, "I never thought I'd see the day you'd smile without flinching." Clara smiled now, soft and sure. "Me neither." "What changed?" Clara looked at the threads on her lap. "I stopped sewing to be seen. I started sewing to see." The next morning, she found a note slipped under her door. No name, just neat handwriting. "My daughter is getting married. She's nervous. She's not a size 2. She's kind and smart, and has been through more than she should have. I want her to feel beautiful, not in spite of her story, but because of it. Would you make her dress?" Clara held the note for a long time. Then she lit a candle, pulled out a fresh sheet of muslin, and began again. In every stitch, she whispered the names of women who had once doubted they were enough. And in every finished hem, she reminded them they always had been. Even her own name, Clara Mayfield, once felt like a whisper in someone else's story. Now, it felt like her signature, signed in thread and grace. Seen at the fall festival, the sun filtered through the apple trees that lined the fairgrounds of Pine Hollow, casting dappled shadows over folding chairs and hay bales wrapped in hand-knitted quilts. The Fall Harvest Festival was the town's most beloved tradition, a day where neighbors became family and memories settled into the bones of the earth like the crunch of leaves underfoot. There were booths of cinnamon donuts and caramel apples, the sound of fiddles in the distance, and laughter that rang freely. But for Clara Mayfield, that morning felt heavier. Not burdensome exactly, just full of moments and meaning, stitched together like the seams of the dress she wore. It wasn't white, not even close. It was the color of new olive leaves in spring, soft and forgiving, and shaped not to conceal her, but to hold her. A dress that spoke without fanfare. "This is who I am." Behind a modest backstage tent, Clara stood with hands clasped in front of her. Her friend Maggie was pinning the last hem on a neighbor's dress, a widow in her 70s who insisted on wearing something that made her feel, as she put it, like the earth still wanted to dance with me. "You look like breath," Maggie said to Clara without glancing up. "Like that first exhale when you didn't realize you'd been holding your lungs too long." Clara smiled, the compliment landing deeper than expected. She looked out at the gathering crowd. Familiar faces from the bakery, the library, the town square. People who had once passed by her studio without pause now waited to see what she had sewn with her hands and her heart. The showcase wasn't much. A narrow aisle of burlap runner, a few potted mums on either side, a borrowed speaker humming gentle folk tunes. But to Clara, it was everything. It was the first time she would walk not as someone hoping to be chosen, but as someone who had already chosen herself. The crowd settled. Pastor Jacobs tapped the mic and welcomed everyone. "This year," he said, "we celebrate more than harvest. We celebrate the stories that grow from broken ground." And then Clara heard her name. Her legs felt unsteady as she stepped onto the makeshift runway. The gravel crunched softly beneath her shoes, the breeze carrying the scent of spiced cider and baked pears. There was no roar of applause, just a warm, sincere hush. She walked, not like a model, not like a bride, like a woman who had learned to carry herself again. Every stitch in her dress carried a story. The softened waistline that reminded her bodies were not made to be tamed. The loose sleeves that moved when she did, honoring the rhythm of her life. The hem was embroidered with tiny wildflowers, each one stitched on a morning she woke up and decided not to give up. In the crowd, she caught glimpses of faces that told her story back to her. Mrs. Ellison from the post office, tears catching in the creases beside her eyes. Mayor Thompson with his hand over his heart. And Jonas Carter standing beside his son Eli, looking at her like she had just taught the world how to breathe again. Eli waved. Clara smiled. The showcase continued, other women taking their turns. Some walked with canes, some with gray hair pinned in braids, some holding the hands of granddaughters who giggled in matching dresses. Clara had sewn each one. None of the dresses were alike, because none of the stories were. When the last model stepped off the runway, the applause finally rose. Not loud, but long. Like the town understood they hadn't just watched fabric move, they'd watched healing unfold. Afterward, people came forward. That green dress, a young mother said, tears in her eyes, it made me remember what it felt like to like myself. I haven't worn a dress since my husband passed, said a woman in her 60s. But maybe it's time. Even teenagers lingered, running fingers over seams, asking how she made clothes that felt like stories. Clara answered gently, humbly. She didn't try to explain too much. Some things weren't meant to be described, only felt. Later that afternoon, as booths began packing up and the scent of kettle corn faded into memory, Clara sat on the steps of the church, the very same church where she had once waited in a dress never worn. But this time, she wasn't waiting. She was resting. Jonas walked up, 2 warm cider mugs in hand. He sat beside her without a word, offering 1 cup. You look like someone who remembered how to bloom, he said eventually. Clara sipped. The cider was sweet and spiced, like October in a cup. I didn't think I'd ever be seen again, she whispered. You weren't just seen, Clara, Jonas said, voice low and sure. You were. Honored. She looked at him, then really looked, not through the haze of gratitude or the fear of what might be next, but as a woman who was beginning to trust her own reflection again. Thank you, she said. Jonas shrugged. All I did was open a door. Clara smiled. Sometimes, she said, that's where everything begins. And beneath the fading light of Pine Hollow's most sacred day, Clara Mayfield, the woman in the dress never worn, became the woman in the dress entirely her own. A family by heart. The kitchen was quiet except for the gentle clinking of spoons and the occasional flutter of pages as Eli flipped through his coloring book. Clara stood by the sink, her hands deep in suds, scrubbing a pan that had stubbornly held onto remnants of peach cobbler. She liked this time of day, the late afternoon hush before dinner, the calm before another evening unfolded. She wasn't sure when it had begun to feel like home. Perhaps it was the first morning Jonas poured her coffee without asking how she took it. Or maybe it was the afternoon Eli fell asleep with his head in her lap, fingers tangled in the hem of her skirt. Home, she realized, wasn't always a place. Sometimes it was a rhythm, a knowing. Behind her, Eli suddenly giggled. What is it, sweetheart? Clara asked, drying her hands on a linen towel. I made a picture, he said proudly, holding up a piece of crumpled paper. It's us. Clara took the drawing gently, her fingers brushing the edges. There are 3 stick figures. One tall with brown scribbled hair and a hammer in hand, Jonas. One small, mid-jump, holding a blue balloon, Eli. And one with a green dress, curly hair, and a pie in each hand. Clara. At the top, written in shaky block letters, were the words, My family. She blinked hard. You made me look like a pie superhero, she said with a smile. Because you are, Eli grinned. Dad says your apple pie is better than his mama's. He did not. Did too. Clara chuckled, the sound low and real. She turned just as Jonas walked in, brushing sawdust off his sleeves. What's going on in here? He asked. Apparently, I've dethroned your mother, Clara teased, holding up the drawing. Jonas laughed. Well, Mama always said she'd be glad if someone else took the title. He crossed the room, took the picture, and pinned it to the fridge next to Eli's school calendar and a grocery list written in 2 different handwritings. It looked natural there. That night, as they sat down for dinner, roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and Clara's biscuits, Jonas reached for her hand across the table. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even planned. Just instinctive. Like breathing. "Thank you for staying," he said. Clara met his eyes. "Thank you for letting me." Eli raised his glass of milk. "To pie superheroes." "To family," Jonas corrected gently. "To both," Clara added, lifting her water glass. They clinked glasses, and for a moment, nothing else in the world mattered. Later, after Eli had been tucked in and the dishes were done, Jonas found Clara on the back porch. She was wrapped in the quilt that had once belonged to his wife. He hesitated in the doorway. "You okay?" "Just thinking," she said, "about how quiet used to feel like loneliness, and now it feels like peace." He sat beside her. The crickets sang their nighttime song, and the stars blinked in a place above the old oak tree. "Do you miss her?" Clara asked softly. Jonas took a breath. "Every day, but the ache is different now. It doesn't hollow me out the way it used to." Clara nodded. "You don't make me forget her," he continued. "But you remind me that love doesn't run out. It just makes room." She looked at him then, her heart a fragile thing beating strong in her chest. "I was so sure I'd never belong anywhere again," she whispered. "You're not a guest here, Clara." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I know. Eli told me today." Jonas turned toward her, curious. He drew a picture. "Call me family." Jonas was quiet for a long moment. Then he whispered, "He sees what I see." And for once, Clara didn't shrink from the weight of being loved. That night, as the wind rustled the branches and the moon cast silver across the porch, Clara felt something click gently into place. She wasn't just healing. She was home. And sometimes, family wasn't about blood. It was about who stayed, who listened, who quietly, without asking for anything in return, built a place where your story was safe to unfold. She reached for Jonas's hand. He took it. They didn't need to say another word. Scene at the fall festival. The sun filtered through the apple trees that lined the fairgrounds of Pine Hollow, casting dappled shadows over folding chairs and hay bales wrapped in hand-knitted quilts. The Fall Harvest Festival was the town's most beloved tradition, a day where neighbors became family and memories settled into the bones of the earth like the crunch of leaves underfoot. There were booths of cinnamon donuts and caramel apples, the sound of fiddles in the distance, and laughter that rang freely. But for Clara Mayfield, that morning felt heavier. Not burdensome, exactly, just full. Full of moments and meaning, stitched together like the seams of the dress she wore. It wasn't white, not even close. It was the color of new olive leaves in spring, soft and forgiving, and shaped not to conceal her, but to hold her. A dress that spoke without fanfare. "This is who I am." Behind the modest backstage tent, Clara stood with hands clasped in front of her. Her friend Maggie was pinning the last hem on a neighbor's dress, a widow in her 70s who insisted on wearing something that made her feel, as she put it, like the earth still wanted to dance with me. "You look like breath," Maggie said to Clara without glancing up. "Like that first exhale when you didn't realize you'd been holding your lungs too long." Clara smiled, the compliment landing deeper than expected. She looked out at the gathering crowd, familiar faces from the bakery, the library, the town square. People who had once passed by her studio without pause now waited to see what she had sewn with her hands and her heart. The showcase wasn't much. A narrow aisle of burlap runner, a few potted mums on either side, a borrowed speaker humming gentle folk tunes. But to Clara, it was everything. It was the first time she would walk not as someone hoping to be chosen, but as someone who had already chosen herself. The crowd settled. Pastor Jacobs tapped the mic and welcomed everyone. "This year," he said, "we celebrate more than harvest. We celebrate the stories that grow from broken ground." And then, Clara heard her name. Her legs felt unsteady as she stepped onto the makeshift runway. The gravel crunched softly beneath her shoes, the breeze carrying the scent of spiced cider and baked pears. There was no roar of applause, just a warm, sincere hush. She walked, not like a model, not like a bride, like a woman who had learned to carry herself again. Every stitch in her dress carried a story. The softened waistline that reminded her bodies were not made to be tamed. The loose sleeves that moved when she did, honoring the rhythm of her life. The hem was embroidered with tiny wildflowers, each one stitched on a morning she woke up and decided not to give up. In the crowd, she caught glimpses of faces that told her story back to her. Mrs. Ellison from the post office, tears catching in the creases beside her eyes. Mayor Thompson with his hand over his heart. And Jonas Carter standing beside his son Eli, looking at her like she had just taught the world how to breathe again. Eli waved. Clara smiled. The showcase continued, other women taking their turns. Some walked with canes, some with gray hair pinned in braids, some holding the hands of granddaughters who giggled in matching dresses. Clara had sewn each one. None of the dresses were alike, because none of the stories were. When the last model stepped off the runway, the applause finally rose. Not loud, but long. Like the town understood they hadn't just watched fabric move, they'd watched healing unfold. Afterward, people came forward. That green dress, a young mother said, tears in her eyes, it made me remember what it felt like to like myself. I haven't worn a dress since my husband passed, said a woman in her 60s. But maybe it's time. Even teenagers lingered, running fingers over seams, asking how she made clothes that felt like stories. Clara answered gently, humbly. She didn't try to explain too much. Some things weren't meant to be described, only felt. Later that afternoon, as booze began packing up and the scent of kettle corn faded into memory, Clara sat on the steps of the church, the very same church where she had once waited in a dress never worn. But this time, she wasn't waiting. She was resting. Jonas walked up, 2 warm cider mugs in hand. He sat beside her without a word, offering 1 cup. You look like someone who remembered how to bloom, he said eventually. Clara sipped. The cider was sweet and spiced, like October in a cup. I didn't think I'd ever be seen again, she whispered. You weren't just seen, Clara, Jonas said, voice low and sure. You were honored. She looked at him, then really looked, not through the haze of gratitude or the fear of what might be next, but as a woman who was beginning to trust her own reflection again. Thank you, she said. Jonas shrugged. All I did was open a door. Clara smiled. Sometimes, she said, that's where everything begins. And beneath the fading light of Pine Hollow's most sacred day, Clara Mayfield, the woman in the dress never worn, became the woman in the dress entirely her own. Just enough. There was no ring box, no kneeling in the middle of a restaurant, no thunderous yes echoing beneath the sparkle of fireworks. Just a quiet morning in late November, the kind that slid gently into the bones with the smell of coffee and the hush of frost on the windows. Clara had woken early, stirred by the sound of Eli humming to himself in the next room and the soft clink of Jonas putting away dishes. She padded into the kitchen in thick socks, her cardigan draped over her shoulders, and found Jonas already pouring 2 mugs of coffee. Morning, he said. Is it? She teased, rubbing her eyes. He smiled, the kind of smile that didn't need words to feel like home. They sat at the kitchen table, sunlight slipping through the curtains in slanted ribbons. Clara sipped from the mug he handed her and closed her eyes briefly. It was her favorite kind of coffee, not because of any fancy roast or perfect temperature, because it was handed to her without expectation. Jonas reached into the pocket of his flannel shirt and pulled out something small, not a box, not a ring, just a folded piece of paper. He slid it across the table. Clara opened it. Scrawled in Jonas's distinct, careful handwriting were 7 words. Can we build the rest together, Clara? Her breath caught. He wasn't asking to fix her. He wasn't asking her to forget anything. He was just asking to stay, to keep building the ordinary, beautiful days they'd been quietly stitching together. Clara reached across the table and took his hand. Yes, she said simply. Let's build. They were married beneath the old elm in Jonas's backyard, where Clara had once planted herbs in silence, and Eli had tied ribbons to branches like prayers. There were no tuxedos, no cathedral veils, Just Jonas in his best shirt, Clara in a dress she made herself, the soft blue-gray of early dawn. Eli stood between them, holding both their hands. The guest list was small. Maggie brought cinnamon rolls. Pastor Jacobs officiated with his usual gentle humor. And the town came not as spectators, but as witnesses to something quiet and rare. They didn't promise forever. They promised mornings. They promised space. They promised to listen, to forgive, to laugh at the small things and hold each other through the heavy ones. After the ceremony, Clara looked around at the quilts on the chairs, the cider on the table, the simple garland Eli had made from pine cones and yarn. "This," she whispered to Jonas, "is more than I ever thought I'd get." He leaned down, kissed her temple, and whispered back, "This is just the beginning." The Reclaim Collection. The morning light in Pine Hollow filtered softly through the studio windows above Maggie's bakery, catching dust motes mid-air like suspended hope. Clara stood barefoot at her sewing table, fingertips brushing over a folded bolt of soft cotton linen, the kind that didn't demand attention but welcomed it gently. It had been 3 weeks since the fall festival, and yet the echo of that afternoon still hummed quietly in her chest. The Reclaim Collection had been born not from ambition, but from necessity. A necessity to speak, to breathe, to wrap story in a fabric for those who had long been asked to shrink. Clara had only meant to make one dress, a redemption of the gown that had once held so much ache. But that single act had grown roots, then branches. Now, she had sketches pinned like constellations across the studio walls, dresses with generous bodices, flowing skirts, hidden pockets, and necklines that framed rather than hid. On that particular morning, she was working on a piece requested by Ruth Gallagher, a retired nurse in her late 70s who had once danced every Friday night with her late husband at the VFW. Ruth had said she didn't want a dress for a special occasion, only something that felt like her, still soft, still sturdy, and still able to spin. Clara threaded her needle with steady hands. She no longer rushed her stitches. Each one was a breath, a story held. This wasn't tailoring. It was tribute. Downstairs, the scent of cinnamon and yeast wafted up from Maggie's ovens. The comfort of it grounded her, a constant reminder of how far she'd come from the woman who once sat on church steps in a dress that had never been worn. Later that day, as she ironed a new hem, the doorbell jingled. Clara opened the studio door to find a woman standing uncertainly on the landing. She was in her mid-40s, slight but strong in presence, her hands clutching a faded floral garment bag. "Are you Clara Mayfield?" the woman asked. "I am. Come in." She stepped inside, taking a long look around the sunlit room. Then, with a soft sigh, she unzipped the garment bag. Inside was a dress that might have been beautiful once, peach satin, with puffed sleeves and a neckline that seemed to apologize for taking up space. "This was my mother's," she said. "She wore it to marry my father in 1968. She passed last spring. I kept it in my closet, but it doesn't feel like her anymore. Or like me. I was wondering if maybe it could become something else. Something that breathes." Clara nodded, gently taking the dress into her arms. "Let's sit. Tell me about her." And so the woman, Carolyn, spoke of gardens and strong coffee and a laugh that could unstick grief. Clara listened, as she always did, heart open, pencil moving slowly across paper, sketching not just a dress but a memory in motion. It became routine after that. Women came with garments wrapped in tissue, sealed in boxes, folded under decades of dust and silence. They came not to preserve, but to transform. One brought a dress she had been too afraid to wear after childbirth. Another, the outfit she had worn the day she signed her divorce papers. Some brought nothing but stories. Clara supplied the fabric. Each creation became a quiet anthem. The woman who had survived cancer received a wrap dress in robin's egg blue, embroidered with stitched swallows along the hem. The teenager with scars up her forearms wore a sleeveless design that shimmered in the shoulders like courage in bloom. And the widow who hadn't danced in 20 years wore a red dress to her granddaughter's birthday and twirled until her bones ached with joy. Clara never advertised. There was no website, no storefront, only a chalkboard sign beside Maggie's door. Clara Mayfield. Clothing for bodies that remember. One late afternoon, as Clara folded muslin swatches and set aside new pattern drafts, Jonas climbed the stairs, carrying a tray with 2 mugs and a slice of pie. He didn't knock anymore. He didn't need to. "Maggie says you missed lunch again," he said, setting the tray down beside her. "I lost track of time," Clara admitted. "I was working on something for Carolyn. Her daughter is graduating next week." Jonas picked up the sketchbook lying open on her table. This one. The drawing showed a simple linen shift dress with a sash tied gently at the waist, small hand-embroidered initials stitched near the hem. "CG. It's lovely," he said. "You can tell you listened. That's the part that matters most." He nodded, his eyes lingering on her. "You know," he added, "I think these dresses, they aren't just clothes. They're doorways to who they were and who they still get to be." Clara smiled, a slow, grateful curve of the mouth. "That's exactly what I want them to be." He handed her the mug, and they sat side by side, watching the sun melt into the edge of town. Eli's laughter drifted up from the backyard below. A kite rose and dipped behind the garden fence, its string in his tiny hands. Later that night, as Clara swept fabric scraps from the floor and folded bolts away, she paused at the corner of the room where her own wedding dress hung, or what remained of it. It wasn't a monument anymore. It was part of the collection now, refashioned into panels and trim, bits of lace sewn into the lining of new stories. Not a relic of a moment that never was, but a foundation for moments yet to come. She reached out and ran her fingers over the remaining hem, a soft, unassuming curve of fabric embroidered with the words, "You were always enough." The studio felt like sanctuary, not just for her, but for every woman who had dared to walk through the door and whisper, "I think I want to feel like myself again." And for each of them, Clara offered no miracles, no makeovers, just a place to be heard, to be honored, and to be dressed in something that didn't fix who they were, but celebrated it. As the town of Pine Hollow settled into quiet and the bakery ovens cooled for the night, Clara stood at her sewing table, one hand on a dress form, the other holding a spool of thread. She didn't need music. She didn't need applause. She only needed the rhythm of her own breath, and the certainty that she was creating more than clothing. She was creating belonging. And as the needle pierced fabric again, she smiled to herself. The reclaimed collection wasn't about redemption anymore. It was about reverence, and every stitch was a quiet kind of love. The studio with her name on it. The bell above the door rang softly as the morning light spilled into the front room. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just a gentle chime that seemed to say, "You're welcome here." Clara stood behind the worn oak counter, fingers tracing the edge of her sewing shears. A pot of chamomile tea steamed behind her. The sign on the glass still made her heart flutter every time she glanced at it. Clara May Studio, clothing for bodies that breathe. She hadn't picked the name out of vanity. It had taken her a long time to believe she could put her name on anything and have it mean more than just survival. But here she was, in a space with her name on the window and her heart stitched into every hem. The studio was modest, but it had soul. Exposed brick walls lined with bolts of fabric in soft earth tones. A display rack of dresses in olive green, marigold, muted lavender. A hand-lettered chalkboard read, "Come as you are. Leave with something made just for you." The first customer of the day came just after 9. Her name was Evelyn. She wore a coat too big for her frame and carried a garment bag that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. "I heard you don't judge," she said, voice barely above a whisper. Clara smiled and gestured to the armchair beside the fitting mirror. "Not my job to. Can I make you some tea?" Evelyn nodded. When she opened the bag, the fabric that spilled out was once ivory, but had faded to a gentle pearl. A wedding dress, vintage lace, delicate buttons along the back. "It was my mother's," Evelyn said. "I wanted to wear it for my second wedding, but he passed 2 weeks before the date." Clara didn't rush to respond. She let the silence do what it does best when held with care. Then she reached out, touched the edge of the lace, and said softly, "Let's find a way to let it speak again." For the next 2 hours, they worked side by side. Evelyn spoke in broken stories, about her mother's laugh, about falling in love again at 60, about how grief had taught her not to wait. Clara listened, measured, pinned. They didn't talk about trends. They talked about memory. When Evelyn left, her dress wasn't done yet, but her shoulders were straighter. That's how most days went. Some women brought dresses they had outgrown physically. Others brought dresses they'd never dared to wear in the first place. A few came in just to sit, to talk, to see if it was true that there was a place in town where you could be both broken and beautiful without anyone trying to fix you. Clara made sure it was true. She kept a mending jar on the counter. People dropped in buttons and scraps, notes of gratitude, sometimes even secrets scribbled on fabric swatches. She never read them aloud, just kept them in the jar as proof that healing had a sound and a texture, and sometimes even a thread count. Jonah stopped by every day, not always to say much, sometimes just to bring her lunch, or refill the tea tin, or leave a flower from the garden on the windowsill. He never tried to claim space, only made sure she had room to grow into her own. And Eli, sweet Eli, once walked in with a crayon drawing of the studio. In it, Clara had a cape made of scissors and a crown made of measuring tape. "Because you make people feel like superheroes," he said simply. She framed it and hung it behind the register. Some days were quiet. No customers. Just the hum of the sewing machine and the creak of the floorboards when the sun shifted. On those days, Clara sewed, not for clients, but for herself. Loose dresses with pockets deep enough to carry grief and hope at once. Aprons that wrapped around the waist like a hug. Shawls that draped like forgiveness. One afternoon, Maggie came in with cinnamon rolls and news. "You're being talked about, you know. People are saying you're doing holy work up here." Clara laughed, brushing flour from Maggie's cheek. "I'm just sewing clothes." Maggie shook her head. "No, honey. You're reminding people they deserve to take up space." By the end of the month, the appointment book was full. Not with names of the rich or famous. Just names written in all caps or shaky cursive. Doris, Maria, B.V., Tamika. Each with a story. Each with a reason they walked through that door. And every time Clara turned the key in the lock each morning, she reminded herself, this isn't a business. This is a welcome. This is a home where fabric listens. Where stitches remember. Where the woman who once waited in a dress, never worn, now makes clothes that help others feel seen, held, and whole. And every dress that left Clara May's studio carried not just her label, but her quiet, resilient love, the kind that doesn't shout or shine, but stays. Like a thread through time, like a name on a door that finally, fully belongs. From left behind to loved. The late summer sun stretched long golden fingers across the backyard, casting soft shadows beneath the canopy of marigolds Clara had planted just months before. Their orange and amber petals bloomed boldly, bright against the worn wood of the garden fence, as though they had always known their time would come. The scent of earth and sun-warmed blossoms filled the air, carrying with it a kind of quiet grace, a benediction for beginnings. Clara stood barefoot in the garden, her toes curling into the cool soil. She wore the dress she had redesigned from the remnants of her unworn wedding gown. The fabric, once rigid and reserved for a day that never came, now moved freely with her body, soft, flowing, alive. It was the same dress, yet utterly transformed. Not for an aisle, not for an altar, for her. Eli's small hand slipped into hers, anchoring her to the moment. He looked up with a toothy grin, his cheeks still smudged with flour from baking that morning. "You look like magic," he said simply. Clara laughed, surprised by how the sound came out so naturally. "These days, do I?" He nodded, serious now, like someone who makes wishes come true. "You're my wish." Her breath caught, not from sorrow, but from the staggering gentleness of being seen. From the porch, Jonas watched them, his hand resting on the railing, his shoulders relaxed in a way they hadn't been for years. The worry lines around his eyes had softened. There was still grief in him. There always would be, but it lived peacefully now beside hope. He didn't say anything as Clara looked over at him. He just smiled, and that smile said everything. Clara knelt beside Eli and helped him adjust the little paper crown he had crafted from leftover quilt scraps and glitter glue. He insisted she wear it too. So she did, perching it delicately over her curls. Queens wear crowns, he had explained. And moms. Real ones. She had never been called that before. Not by anyone who meant it. But when Eli had first whispered it weeks ago during a thunderstorm, curling beside her on the couch, she hadn't corrected him. She hadn't needed to. Some truths didn't ask for permission. They simply were. Today wasn't an occasion in the traditional sense. No holiday. No anniversary. Just a day. Their day. Jonas had made lemonade and grilled cheese the way Eli liked, with too much butter and not enough crust. Clara had picked apples from the neighbor's tree with permission and turned them into a pie that was now cooling on the kitchen sill. There were no guests. No announcements. Only love made visible in the way their lives now wove together like a familiar patchwork quilt. After lunch, Clara led Eli to the old wooden swing that Jonas had reinforced weeks earlier. It still creaked, still tilted slightly to the left, but Eli loved it more for those imperfections. Clara pushed him gently, the rhythm slow and even. Each time he swung forward, he shouted something new. I'm a rocket. I'm a dragon. I'm flying. You're loved, Clara whispered each time he returned. When he tired, she sat beside him on the grass. He leaned against her, his fingers tracing the hem of her dress. She felt his breathing slow. Then, out of nowhere, he said, You're my mom now, right? Clara looked down at him, the weight of his words as soft and solid as his little body pressed into her side. If you want me to be, she said. I already picked you. Later that evening, as the sky faded to lavender and fireflies began to blink like old porch lights, turning on one by one, Clara walked the garden paths alone. Jonas had taken Eli inside for a bath and a bedtime story. The house was full of their voices, faint through the screen door, full of laughter and quiet care. She paused near the tallest marigolds, their petals warm in the last light. The same breeze that once swept through the church steps where she had been left alone now rustled gently around her. But it no longer felt hollow. It felt like breath, like belonging. She touched the pendant around her neck, a tiny sewing needle charm Jonas had given her the day she signed the lease for her studio. To remind you of all the ways you've stitched the world back together, he had said. And it was true. She had sewn and mended and created not just fabric, but a life. A life that saw her, held her, asked nothing but that she be exactly who she already was. Clara tilted her face to the stars just beginning to show and whispered, Thank you. Not to anyone in particular, just to the world, to Grace, to the winding path that led her here. Not as a bride, as a woman, a mother, a maker. She had once been the woman left behind, her heart folded like the dress in a box she couldn't bring herself to open. Now, she wore her story with pride, and not because someone had finally chosen her, because she had chosen herself first. Inside, the kettle whistled softly. The window glowed golden. Eli's laughter danced down the hallway. Clara turned back toward the house with the sure steps of someone who belonged. And as she reached the porch, Jonas opened the screen door, holding a cup of tea and a smile that made the world quiet. Welcome home, he said. I never really left, she replied. And beneath a sky embroidered with stars, in a garden full of marigolds, Clara Mayfield, the woman once abandoned, became the mother, the partner, the artist fully seen. And this time, she wasn't waiting at the threshold. She was standing in the center of her life. The lesson from Clara Mayfield. When you choose yourself, the world shifts too. In a world that constantly demands perfection, from appearances to roles to milestones, we often forget that the bravest thing we can do is sit quietly in the middle of our brokenness and choose ourselves again. Clara Mayfield didn't walk out of a fairy tale. She wasn't rescued by a prince, nor did she emerge as some idealized version of herself after being left behind. Instead, she began simply by breathing, one long, quiet breath on the church steps where her heart once cracked wide open. From there, the smallest actions, brewing coffee, teaching little Eli how to bake, stitching her old wedding dress, wove together a new woman. Not one who became better to earn love, but one who simply remembered she was already worthy of it. In today's world, many of us have been Clara in our own way. Maybe it wasn't a wedding dress left behind, but a dream that didn't come true, a relationship that broke us, a rejection that made us doubt our worth. We wait, sometimes desperately, for someone to see us, to choose us, to tell us we're enough. But like Clara learned, the most important validation doesn't come from someone else. It comes from within. Her story also reminds us of the quiet power of community and connection. Jonas didn't try to fix Clara. He just opened the door. Eli didn't need a reason to love a stranger. He simply felt her warmth. In a fast-paced world obsessed with personal success, sometimes the most powerful gift we can offer another human being is space. Space to simply be. The magic of Clara's transformation wasn't in the dress or the festival stage. It was in the moment she stopped waiting to be chosen and started living like someone who had already chosen herself. And as she did, she made room for others, especially women carrying quiet pain, to be seen, to feel worthy, to heal. We don't need a dramatic turning point to change our lives. Sometimes it starts by folding away an old dress, calling a friend for lunch, or simply standing in front of a mirror and smiling. Not for anyone else, but for yourself. Because the first and most profound choice we can make is to choose ourselves. Before we go, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Are you tuning in from the heartland of America, a quiet countryside, or maybe a bustling city dreaming of open fields? Drop a comment. Below, I read every single one. And if this story touched your heart, inspired you, or simply gave you a moment of warmth in your day, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another uplifting story like this. Thank you so much for being here. Your support means everything, and I can't wait to bring you more heartfelt stories soon. Until next time, stay kind, stay inspired, and I'll see you in the next one.